The first time my father apologized for introducing me, I was 12 years old. Not to me, to someone else. We were standing in the middle of a factory where he'd worked for almost 20 years. I still remember wearing oversized safety goggles that kept sliding down my nose. One of his coworkers smiled at me. "So, this is your daughter." Before I could answer, Dad laughed awkwardly. "Yeah. She's going through one of those phases where she thinks fixing machines is more interesting than school." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because I thought it was a joke. Years later, I realized it wasn't. My name is Claire Dawson. I'm 34 years old. If you asked my parents what I did for a living, they'd probably tell you I was still working around factories. If they were feeling generous, they might say I was a maintenance technician. If they were embarrassed, they'd simply say, "Claire never really found herself." Neither answer was true, but neither had ever bothered asking. Growing up, there were only two stories in our house. One belonged to my older sister. The other belonged to me. Sophia was the brilliant one, straight A student, student council president, MBA before she turned 26. Every family gathering eventually became another celebration of whatever promotion she'd earned next. Claire, well, Claire liked taking things apart. Old radios, coffee makers, broken lawnmowers. At 14, I rebuilt my grandfather's antique drill press with help from a retired mechanic down the street. Dad looked at it for less than 10 seconds before saying, "You'd get further if you spent that much time studying math." Ironically, math eventually became the reason companies paid me millions, just not the kind taught inside classrooms. Everything changed after my second year of college. I hated it. Not learning, college itself. Every lecture felt farther away from the real world than the last. Meanwhile, every weekend I worked part-time repairing industrial equipment inside manufacturing plants. The factories fascinated me. Machines, production lines, people solving real problems every minute. One afternoon, I called my parents. "I think I'm leaving school." Silence. Then Dad asked, "For what?" "I've been offered a full-time position." "As what?" "Industrial maintenance." His answer came immediately. "Absolutely not." Mom sounded even more upset. "You'll throw your future away." "I don't think I am." "You'll regret this." "Maybe, but I'd rather regret my own decisions than spend my life living someone else's." I left college 2 weeks later. That single decision quietly divided my life into two parts: the daughter my parents hoped I'd become, and the woman I eventually chose to be. 12 years passed. Some things improved. My relationship with my parents wasn't one of them. Every few months, Mom insisted on organizing a family dinner. "Families need to stay connected," she always said. Translation: Sophia had another achievement everyone needed to hear about. This particular Sunday afternoon felt no different. When I pulled into the driveway, Sophia's white Mercedes was already parked beside Dad's truck. Of course, she was always first. I walked inside wearing dark jeans work boots and a navy jacket embroidered with my company's old service logo. I had come directly from a manufacturing site. Mom looked me up and down. "You couldn't change first." I glanced at my sleeves. There was a faint streak of grease near one cuff. "I drove straight here," she sighed. "Your sister's clients are stopping by later. I don't think they'll notice my sleeve." "They'll notice," she replied quietly. "They always notice." I smiled politely. "I'll try standing behind the refrigerator." Sophia laughed from the dining room. "Still impossible." She hugged me. We'd never really been enemies, not exactly. Sophia simply believed everything our parents believed, that success looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, dressed a certain way. Lunch started pleasantly enough. Dad discussed production delays at work. Mom talked about church events. Sophia described an upcoming board presentation. I mostly listened. Eventually, Dad looked toward me. "So, still repairing machines?" I nodded. "Some of them." Sophia smiled. "I honestly don't know how your knees survive crawling around factory floors." They've adapted, Dad chuckled. That's about all that's adapted. Nobody laughed except Mom. I took another bite of my lunch. Years ago, comments like that would have ruined my day. Now, they mostly reminded me how little my parents actually knew about my life. Dad folded his napkin. You know, we had dinner with the Hendersons last week. Oh, they asked what you were doing these days. I looked up. What did you tell them? He shrugged. I said you still worked maintenance. Mom quickly added. It was easier than explaining everything. What exactly is everything? Another pause. Finally, she said, You know, the dropping out. I looked around the table. So, you were embarrassed? No, Mom answered quickly. We just didn't want people asking questions. They were asking questions, I replied gently. You just didn't like the answers. Sophia shifted slightly in her chair. Dad didn't mean anything by it. I know. He just worries. I smiled. He stopped worrying years ago. What does that mean? Dad asked. It means you've already decided who I am. Silence. Then Dad leaned back. I decided based on your choices. I did choose. Exactly. You chose factory work. I chose learning. He shook his head. You chose the easy road. I actually laughed. The easy road. There was nothing easy about 16-hour shifts repairing failed production lines at 2 in the morning. Nothing easy about teaching myself automation systems because nobody else would. Nothing easy about sleeping inside airports because another factory breakdown couldn't wait until morning. But I didn't explain any of that. Because people rarely hear what contradicts the story they've already written. Instead, I simply asked, Are you happy? Dad frowned. With what? With the version of me you've created? Nobody answered. Mom quietly stood to clear the dishes. Sophia looked down at her plate. Dad stared through the dining room window. Then, almost casually, he said something that should have hurt far more than it did. Claire, if you're going to keep showing up dressed like this, maybe stop coming when we're entertaining guests. The room became completely still. Mom didn't object. Sophia looked uncomfortable. I slowly pushed my chair back. You know, I said quietly, I've spent years wondering why I never felt comfortable in this house anymore. I picked up my jacket. I think I finally understand. Dad sighed. Don't be dramatic. I'm not, I smiled. I'm just finished pretending this conversation surprises me. I walked toward the front door. Behind me, Dad called out one last time, You'll understand someday. I rested one hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, I answered, I hope one day. You understand that dignity doesn't come from wearing a suit. Then I stepped outside. The cool afternoon air felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, leaving didn't feel like walking away from my family. It felt like walking back toward myself. Monday mornings always began the same way: coffee, production reports, investment summaries. By 7:30, I was sitting in the conference room on the top floor of Bennett Industrial Capital. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the river. The long oak table was already covered with acquisition files. No grease-stained jacket today. Instead, a charcoal blazer, white blouse, leather portfolio. The transformation always amused me. Because if my parents had walked through those doors, they probably wouldn't have recognized me. Rachel Moore looked up from her laptop. Good weekend. I laughed. Depends. Family, Toe. Family. She nodded sympathetically. Enough said. Rachel had been my closest friend for almost a decade. More importantly, she was the best mergers and acquisitions attorney I'd ever worked with. The first file she slid across the table carried the logo of another manufacturing company we'd recently acquired. Plant turnaround is ahead of schedule. Excellent. The workforce, 98% retained. I smiled. Good. That answer mattered more than the profit projections. Years earlier, While everyone assumed I was fixing machines, something unexpected had happened. Factory owners began asking questions, not about repairs, about operations. Why do our production lines keep failing? What would you change? How would you redesign this process? One consultation became 5. 5 became 50. Eventually, I realized I wasn't being paid for turning wrenches anymore. I was being paid for understanding factories better than the executives running them. At 28, I founded Dawson Industrial Advisory. 3 years later, we launched Bennett Industrial Capital, an investment group focused on buying struggling manufacturers, not to strip them apart, not to lay people off, but to modernize them, keep jobs, protect communities built around those factories. Some investors chased quick profits. I chased long-term survival. Maybe because I'd spent enough years standing beside production workers to know that behind every machine, there was usually a family depending on it. Rachel closed one folder before opening another. This one came in late Friday. I glanced at the company name, William Carter Manufacturing. She smiled. The CEO specifically requested you. Did he say why? He said. Rachel checked her notes. Claire understands factories better than anyone I've ever met. I recognized the name immediately. William Carter. Nearly 11 years earlier, he'd been one of my first consulting clients. His factory had been losing millions because of repeated equipment failures. Everyone blamed the machines. I blamed management decisions. He listened. Most people didn't. Rachel continued. He's retiring. He wants to sell. Only one condition. He refuses to sell to anyone planning mass layoffs. I nodded slowly. I like him already. She slid the confidential folder toward me. I thought you might. I opened it. The first page contained a company overview. The second, executive leadership. I stopped reading. Rachel noticed immediately. What? I turned the page toward her. Two familiar names stared back at us. Harold Dawson, Chief Operating Officer, Sophia Dawson, Chief Financial Officer. Rachel looked at me. Is that? I nodded once. My family. The room became very quiet. After a long pause, Rachel finally asked, So, what do you want to do? I looked back down at the file, then out across the river beyond the glass. For years, my parents had believed I spent my life repairing broken machines. Neither of them realized. My real job had quietly become rebuilding entire companies, and somehow, fate had just placed theirs in front of me. I didn't tell my parents. Not that day, not the next week, not even after our investment committee unanimously approved moving forward with William Carter Manufacturing. Some people would probably call that dishonest. I called it waiting until the right conversation actually mattered. Besides, they'd never asked what I did. Not really. They asked questions, but they never waited long enough to hear the answers. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing engineering reports. Mom. I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. Hi, Mom. Claire. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. I need a favor. Of course she did. What is it? Sophia is speaking at the State Business Leadership Summit next Thursday. I thought it would mean a lot if you came. I smiled faintly. You've never asked me to attend one of her events before. Well, Mom hesitated. Families should support each other. Interesting. Support. A word that had always seemed to move in only one direction. What time? 7. Business School Auditorium. I'll be there. When I hung up, Rachel looked over from across the conference table. Everything okay? I've been invited to watch my sister explain success to future executives. She laughed. Sounds entertaining. I have a feeling it will be. The auditorium was almost full. Students, professors, young professionals. Sophia stood confidently on stage beneath bright white lights. She looked exactly like someone born to lead. Tailored navy suit, perfect posture, confident smile. I genuinely admired those qualities. Despite everything, she had worked hard for them. I quietly slipped into a seat near the back. She never noticed. Halfway through the presentation, a student raised his hand. If someone wanted to leave college to start working, what advice would you give? Sophia smiled politely. I actually have personal experience with that. My stomach tightened. Oh no. My younger sister left college after her second year. Several students looked interested. She believed experience mattered more than education. Sophia shrugged lightly. Today she still works maintenance in manufacturing plants. A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed through the room. Sophia continued. She's a wonderful person, but talent without discipline rarely reaches its potential. If she'd finished school, I'm sure she'd be doing much more with her life. Nobody knew I was sitting 15 rows behind them. Nobody except one person, Professor Daniels. He'd consulted for one of our portfolio companies 2 years earlier. His eyes widened the moment he recognized me. He looked confused, then embarrassed. I simply gave him a tiny smile and gently shook my head. Please don't say anything. He understood immediately. The presentation continued. Students applauded. Sophia answered questions about corporate leadership, risk management, strategic planning. I quietly stood before the crowd dispersed. As I reached the hallway, someone called my name. Claire, Professor Daniels hurried toward me. I had no idea she was talking about you. It's all right. No, he frowned. It isn't. I literally assigned one of your manufacturing case studies last semester. I laughed softly. Please don't tell her. He blinked. Why not? Because eventually, I'd rather she discover the truth naturally. He studied my face for a moment. You know, I've taught leadership for 26 years. The people who actually have it rarely need everyone else to know. I thanked him and walked outside. The evening air felt cool against my face. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Mostly, I felt sad. Sophia had just spent 20 minutes teaching students about leadership. Without realizing, she'd used one of the least informed examples imaginable. Oh. 3 days later, Rachel entered my office carrying another folder. You might want to see this. Inside were screenshots, social media posts, family group messages, photos from the business summit. Mom had proudly shared them everywhere. One caption caught my attention immediately. So proud of one daughter who never gave up on her education. Every family needs someone willing to work hard for success. Hundreds of comments followed. Congratulations, beautiful family. You must be so proud. Then, an aunt I'd barely spoken to in years commented, How's Claire doing these days? Mom replied publicly. Still doing repair work, unfortunately. We keep hoping she'll eventually find something more stable. I stared at the screen. Rachel quietly closed the folder. You okay? I nodded. They really believe that. What? That my entire life can be summarized in one sentence. She hesitated. Does it bother you? I thought about it carefully. Less than it used to. More than I expected. Rachel smiled sympathetically. Good. I looked up. Good. It means you're still human. The following Tuesday, William Carter arrived exactly on time. 72 years old, silver hair, firm handshake, sharp eyes. He carried himself like someone who had spent decades solving problems without needing to raise his voice. Claire, it's good to see you again. You too, William. He looked around our conference room. I'll admit, this office is slightly nicer than the maintenance workshop where we first met. I laughed. I've upgraded desks. But I still like factories better. So do I, he replied. We spent nearly 4 hours reviewing financial statements, production forecasts, labor contracts, and expansion opportunities. William knew his company better than anyone. He also knew something wasn't right. Finally, he closed the last folder. I'll be honest. I've received offers from 4 investment groups. Rachel asked, why not accept one of them? he sighed. Because every one of them plans to shut down 2 plants, lay off hundreds of people. They call it optimization. I call it abandoning the people who built this company. He looked directly at me. 11 years ago, you spent 3 days sleeping on a folding chair inside my factory. I smiled. I remember. Our production line had collapsed. You fixed it. No? I corrected gently. I fixed the planning. He nodded. Exactly. That's why I'm here. He leaned forward. I don't need someone to buy my company. I need someone to protect it. The room fell quiet. After a moment, I answered. If we move forward, there'll be changes. I expect that. But there won't be layoffs simply because a spreadsheet says they're cheaper. William smiled. That's the answer I was hoping for. Rachel slid a confidentiality agreement across the table. William signed without hesitation. Then he reached into his leather briefcase and removed one final folder. This contains executive evaluations, performance reviews, internal audit reports. You should probably read them before making a final decision. I opened the folder. The very first section carried my father's name. Harold Dawson, Chief Operating Officer. Overall performance, strong leadership, deep manufacturing knowledge, excellent crisis management. Then, several pages later, a recurring concern appeared. Repeatedly postponed equipment modernization despite engineering recommendations. I turned another page. Sophia. Outstanding financial reporting. Excellent investor relations. Then, a different concern. Maintenance budgets reduced below engineering recommendations for 3 consecutive years. I slowly closed the folder. William noticed my expression. You know them personally. Yes. He nodded thoughtfully. Then let me tell you something. They're not bad people. They're capable people. But somewhere along the way, they started believing quarterly numbers mattered more than factory floors. I looked through the conference room windows toward the skyline. It sounded strangely familiar. People who judge success from a distance, without looking closely enough to understand how things actually worked. William stood. I'll leave the decision with you. He extended his hand. If anyone can save this company, I believe it's the young woman everyone once underestimated because she wore steel-toe boots. After he left, Rachel remained silent for several minutes. Finally, she asked, So, are we buying it? I looked once more at my father's evaluation, then at Sophia's, then at the thousands of employees whose futures depended on what happened next. This wasn't about proving my family wrong. It never had been. It was about deciding whether I was willing to become responsible for protecting something they'd spent years helping build. I closed the folder. Start the due diligence. Rachel smiled. I thought you'd say that. Outside our office windows, the city carried on as though nothing had changed, but somewhere across town, my father and sister were finishing another ordinary workday. Neither of them had the slightest idea that the woman they'd spent years calling the family disappointment had just begun deciding the future of the company they believed would always belong to someone else. The due diligence process lasted almost 6 weeks. Most people imagine corporate acquisitions as dramatic boardroom negotiations, expensive suits, aggressive lawyers, late-night phone calls. The reality looked very different. It was spreadsheets, factory visits, safety inspections, maintenance records, employee interviews. Thousands upon thousands of pages that quietly revealed whether a company was healthy or simply pretending to be. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I visited one of William Carter Manufacturing's plants before sunrise. Not because I had to, because factories tell the truth before executives arrive. Workers don't perform for visitors at 6 o'clock in the morning. Machines don't lie. Production lines don't care about titles. They simply show you what works and what doesn't. The first plant surprised me. The employees were skilled, proud of their work. Many had been there 20 or 30 years. What worried me wasn't the people. It was the equipment. I stopped beside a massive hydraulic press that looked older than I was. One maintenance technician noticed me studying it. "Beautiful machine," he smiled. "It was." I looked at him. "What happened?" He shrugged. "We've been asking for replacement parts for almost 2 years. Management keeps pushing it to next quarter." He opened one of the electrical panels. Several temporary repairs immediately caught my attention. Copper wire instead of factory connectors. He nodded. "We make do." "You have to." I quietly wrote something in my notebook, not because anyone had broken rules, because they were trying to keep production running despite decisions made somewhere far above them. As we walked through the plant, the technician suddenly asked, "Are you one of the consultants?" "In a way." He smiled. "Well, if you ever meet the people upstairs, tell them machines eventually stop believing promises." That sentence stayed with me. Machines eventually stop believing promises. So do people. Over the following weeks, I interviewed dozens of employees, shift supervisors, engineers, machine operators, quality inspectors. Almost everyone described the same pattern. The company wasn't failing, it was slowly being worn down. Necessary repairs postponed, training budgets reduced, preventive maintenance delayed. Everything looked reasonable on quarterly financial reports, until you stood beside the machines actually doing the work. One afternoon, I sat alone in an empty conference room reading engineering reports from the previous 4 years. Every major recommendation carried nearly identical comments. Recommended replacement deferred, budget postponed, review next fiscal year. Rachel walked in carrying coffee. "You've been staring at those reports for 2 hours." I nodded. "Because they don't make sense." "What do you mean?" I handed her one of the files. "This conveyor failed 3 times. The engineering department requested replacement every year." Rachel scanned the report. "It never happened." "Exactly," she frowned. "Who approved postponing it?" I flipped to the authorization page. At the bottom, my father's signature, Harold Dawson, Chief Operating Officer. I closed the folder quietly. Rachel studied my face. "That can't feel good." "No, it doesn't." For a moment, I simply looked out the window. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "My dad taught me something when I was 12. He told me, never ignore a strange sound inside a machine." Rachel waited. "He said small problems always become expensive problems." I tapped the report gently. He knew that. "So why ignore it here?" I didn't answer. Because I already suspected the reason. Pressure, budgets, quarterly targets. Sometimes good leaders make poor decisions because they're trying too hard to protect today's numbers. The tragedy is, tomorrow always arrives eventually. The financial review painted an equally complicated picture. Sophia's department had produced beautiful reports. Revenue was steady, profit margins looked healthy, shareholders were satisfied, everything appeared strong. Until we looked underneath. Maintenance spending had dropped every year. Training budgets had nearly disappeared. Equipment depreciation was increasing faster than replacement investments. Rachel leaned over one spreadsheet. "Technically, none of this is fraudulent." "I know. It's just short-sighted." "Exactly. The company wasn't being destroyed by bad people. It was being managed by people who had become obsessed with appearances." That realization hurt more than I expected, because it reminded me of my own family. Growing up, looking successful had always mattered more than feeling fulfilled. The company had slowly adopted the same philosophy. Strong reports, weak foundations, beautiful numbers, tired machines, satisfied investors, exhausted employees. William had been right. The business didn't need rescuing from failure. It needed rescuing from slow neglect. A week before final approval, William invited me to lunch at a small diner across from the original factory. Not an expensive restaurant, just a place he'd visited for almost 40 years. The waitress greeted him by name. "Usual booth." You know me too well, he smiled. After ordering, he looked toward the factory through the front window. I built my first production line over there. I know. I read the history, he laughed. Reading and living are different things. They are. He stirred his coffee quietly. I've been thinking about your father. I looked up. What about him? He wasn't always like this. William spoke without bitterness. When Harold first became operations director, he spent more time on the production floor than I did. He knew every mechanic's first name. He'd crawl under broken machines himself. What changed? William sighed. Titles. I stayed silent. The higher people climb, the easier it becomes to mistake distance for leadership. He looked directly at me. Don't let that happen to you. I won't. I believe you. He smiled. That's why I'm selling to you. Before leaving, he handed me a small brass wrench. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of use. My first toolbox, he said. I carried this every day until I became CEO. I turned it over in my hand. It still works. So does the lesson. He smiled. Never let your office become so comfortable that you forget how loud the factory floor really is. The final board meeting arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Our investment committee approved the acquisition unanimously. Rachel organized the closing documents. Banks finalized financing. Lawyers prepared signatures. Everything was ready, except one final meeting with William's executive team. Rachel glanced across the conference table. Nervous? A little. Because it's your family. I nodded. They still have no idea. She smiled gently. They're about to. Friday, 9 o'clock. William Carter Manufacturing Headquarters. The executive boardroom overlooked the largest production plant. I arrived 15 minutes early through a private entrance. Rachel reviewed the final documents one last time. You ready? As I'll ever be. William stepped inside. They're all here. I took a slow breath. Through the closed boardroom doors, I could hear familiar voices. Dad discussing production forecasts. Sophia talking confidently about next quarter's financial outlook, completely unaware that the company they were planning for already had a different future waiting outside the room. William smiled kindly. After all these years, I think you've earned this moment. He opened the door. The conversation inside stopped immediately. Dad looked up first, then frowned. For a brief second, he looked genuinely confused. Claire? Moments later, Sophia turned around. Her eyes widened. What are you doing here? Neither of them stood. Neither understood. They simply assumed I'd walked into the wrong meeting. Rachel entered behind me carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the logo of Bennett Industrial Capital. William walked to the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, he smiled. Before we begin, I'd like you to meet the person who will be leading the next chapter of this company. Silence. William looked toward me. Claire Dawson, founder and managing partner of Bennett Industrial Capital. Our acquiring partner. For several seconds, nobody moved. Dad stared at me as though he'd forgotten how to blink. Sophia slowly looked from me to Rachel, to the acquisition documents already bearing my signature, then back again. Her voice barely escaped above a whisper. No. William nodded gently. I'm afraid there's no mistake. He turned toward the board. Effective today. Bennett Industrial Capital has acquired William Carter Manufacturing. He smiled at me. And Claire Dawson is now chairwoman of this company. The room fell completely silent. For the first time in my life. My father looked at me without seeing the daughter who had dropped out of college. He looked at me and realized he had never really known who I had become. No one spoke, not for several long seconds. The silence inside the boardroom felt heavier than any argument ever could. My father looked from me to William, then to the acquisition agreement lying in front of him. This, he finally managed. This isn't funny. William answered before I could. I agree. That's why nobody is joking. Rachel calmly distributed copies of the closing documents to every executive seated around the table. The cover page read, Bennett Industrial Capital Final Acquisition Agreement. Sophia picked hers up with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the signature page, then back to the first page again. This can't be right, she whispered. Rachel smiled professionally. It has already been approved by the board. The transaction officially closed at 8:47 this morning. I watched my father's expression slowly change. Confusion, disbelief, recognition. He looked at me differently than he ever had before, not as his daughter, not as the college dropout, but as the person now responsible for every major decision inside the company where he'd spent almost 30 years. William stepped aside. The floor is yours, Claire. Every face turned toward me. I stood slowly, not because I wanted to enjoy the moment, because I wanted to make sure I chose every word carefully. I know today is unexpected, I began. And I know some of you have questions. I paused. So let me answer the most important one first. No. I did not buy this company to prove anyone wrong. I looked directly at my father. If that had been my goal, I would have walked away years ago. The room remained silent. I continued. I bought this company because I believe it's worth saving. I pressed a button on the remote beside me. The large presentation screen came alive. The first slide showed photographs from every factory I'd visited over the previous month. Production workers, maintenance crews, assembly lines, people laughing during lunch breaks, engineers repairing equipment. No financial graphs, no stock prices, just people. One board member frowned. I expected financial projections. They're coming, I answered. But before we discuss numbers, I want everyone to remember what those numbers represent. I changed to the next slide. Every employee, every department, every production plant, more than 2,000 names. These aren't labor costs. They're families. William smiled quietly from the end of the table. He'd heard me say something similar years ago. Dad still hadn't spoken. Neither had Sophia. I moved to the next slide. Maintenance records, delayed equipment replacements, emergency repair costs. The trend was impossible to ignore. We're spending millions repairing machines that should have been replaced years ago, I explained calmly. Not because our maintenance team failed, because they kept being asked to postpone the inevitable. My father lowered his eyes. He already knew where this conversation was going. I looked toward him. Dad, I read every engineering recommendation from the past 4 years. The room became noticeably quieter. I also read every approval. No accusation, no anger, just facts. I know why you made those decisions. He finally looked up. You do. You were trying to protect quarterly earnings. He blinked. I was trying to protect the company. I know, I answered softly. But somewhere along the way, we started protecting reports instead of reality. Nobody interrupted, because nobody could. The documents spoke for themselves. After several moments, one of the senior directors cleared his throat. So, what's your plan? I smiled. Thank you. That's the first question we should have asked today. The next presentation lasted almost an hour. Not once did I mention revenge. Not once did I mention my family. Instead, we discussed rebuilding. Every factory would receive modern equipment over the next 18 months. Preventive maintenance budgets would immediately increase. Employee training programs would return. Safety upgrades would begin within 60 days. The investment wasn't small, nearly $85 million. One director looked stunned. You're willing to spend that much? I'm willing to invest that much, I corrected gently. There's a difference. Rachel displayed the financial projections. If modernization succeeds, operating efficiency increases 22% within 3 years. If we don't, another slide appeared. Unexpected shutdowns, Equipment failures, customer losses. The room didn't need convincing. The evidence was overwhelming. William leaned back in his chair, smiling. This, he said quietly, is exactly why I chose her. When the presentation ended, the board voted unanimously to approve the modernization plan. Not a single objection, not even from my father. Only one agenda item remained. Executive leadership. The room immediately grew tense again. Rachel handed everyone another folder. Inside were the proposed organizational changes. My father opened his first, Sophia hers. Neither spoke. I looked around the table. I want to make one thing very clear. I didn't buy this company to replace people. I bought it because I believe good people can become better leaders. I turned toward my father, Harold Dawson. He sat perfectly still. You've spent nearly 30 years inside these factories. No one knows their history better than you. His jaw tightened. But history and daily operations aren't the same thing anymore. I took a slow breath. I'm asking you to become senior operations advisor. You'll mentor every new plant manager. You'll help redesign production systems. But you won't carry responsibility for quarterly operational decisions. He stared at the paper. So, I'm being demoted. No, I answered honestly. You're being asked to teach. The knowledge you've spent 30 years earning deserves to outlive your job title. He didn't respond, not immediately. I turned toward Sophia. She looked nervous, far more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Sophia, she met my eyes. Your financial reporting is exceptional. She looked surprised. I've always believed that. I know. The problem isn't your accounting. It's that numbers became more important than operations. She slowly nodded. I continued. I'm creating a new position. Director of Financial Planning. You'll work directly with engineering and maintenance before finalizing next year's budgets. No more making decisions from spreadsheets alone. You'll spend 2 days every month inside the plants. She actually smiled a little. You want the CFO walking factory floors? I want every executive walking factory floors. Several board members quietly laughed. Not mockingly, in agreement. Because everyone understood. Factories couldn't be managed only from conference rooms. That afternoon I walked through Plant 1 wearing the same steel-toe boots my parents used to hate. Word of the acquisition had already spread. Workers looked up as I entered. Some nodded, others smiled politely. Then an older machinist approached. His name tag read, George, 41 years with the company. I've got a question, he said. Go ahead. You're really the new owner? I am. He looked me up and down, then pointed toward my boots. You've actually worked in places like this before. I laughed. For a very long time, he grinned. I figured. You walk too slowly to be an executive. I laughed harder. What does that mean? Most executives rush through factories. They're always looking at their watches. You've spent the last 10 minutes looking at machines. I was listening. Listening. He nodded. Machines talk. If you know what you're hearing, I smiled. My first mentor used to say exactly the same thing. George folded his arms. You know, your dad always made sure this place kept running. I nodded. He worked hard. He did, George agreed. But people worked because they respected his experience. He paused, then looked directly at me. I think they'll stay. Because they respect the way you see them. Those words stayed with me long after he walked away. Late that afternoon, I found my father standing alone beside one of the oldest production lines in the building. He ran his hand slowly across the worn steel frame. Without looking at me, he quietly said, I haven't stood here in years. I joined him. Why not? I got busy. He answered. I thought my job was upstairs. The machine hummed steadily beside us. Finally. He looked around the factory floor. Workers waved as I passed. Maintenance technicians stopped me to suggest improvements. Operators pointed out equipment that needed replacing. No one seemed nervous. They simply talked. My father watched all of it in silence. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "They're not talking to you because you're the owner." I smiled. "No. They're talking to me because I spent years standing where they stand." For the first time in my life, my father didn't have a reply. Because standing in the middle of that factory, he finally understood something titles had hidden from him for years. Respect isn't assigned by an organizational chart. It is earned, one conversation at a time. 1 year later, the company looked nothing like the one I'd purchased. Not because we'd erased its history, because we'd finally started listening to it. The modernization plan finished 3 months ahead of schedule. Every production line that had spent years surviving on temporary repairs had been rebuilt. Old hydraulic systems were replaced. Automation was introduced carefully, not to replace workers, but to remove the dangerous and repetitive tasks that had caused injuries for decades. Maintenance technicians no longer had to beg for replacement parts. Training budgets returned, apprenticeships reopened. Every quarter I spent an entire week working from one of our factories instead of headquarters. Some mornings I sat in board meetings. Other mornings I wore safety glasses and followed mechanics through machine inspections. Rachel once laughed and asked, "Do you realize you're probably the only chairwoman in the country carrying a flashlight and a grease pencil?" I smiled. They're more useful than most executive titles. The numbers eventually reflected what people already felt. Production efficiency increased by 24%. Customer complaints fell to their lowest level in company history. Employee turnover dropped by nearly 40%. The board celebrated the financial success. I celebrated something else. One Friday afternoon, George stopped me outside the maintenance workshop. "You've got a minute." "Always." He handed me a folded piece of paper. "What is this, the employee satisfaction survey?" I laughed. "I've already read it." "No," he smiled. "You read the statistics. I want you to read the comments." That evening I sat alone in my office. Instead of percentages, I found handwritten notes. For the first time in years, management actually asks us what we need. My daughter applied for an internship here because she finally believes this company has a future. "I've worked here 32 years. This is the first owner who knows my name." One note stopped me completely. "Thank you for fixing the machines, but mostly for fixing the feeling that nobody upstairs cared anymore." I quietly folded the papers. Those words meant more than every quarterly report combined. My father's office became noticeably smaller, not physically, emotionally. After accepting the role of senior operations advisor, he spent most of his days walking through plants with younger managers, teaching, explaining, listening. One afternoon, I found him sitting beside a new maintenance supervisor who couldn't have been older than 27. Dad was sketching gearbox diagrams on the back of an old inspection sheet. The young supervisor listened carefully, asked questions, took notes. When they finished, Dad noticed me standing in the doorway. "You've been here long." "Long enough." The young supervisor smiled. "Mr. Dawson just saved me about 3 weeks of mistakes." Dad looked almost embarrassed. "It wasn't much." "It was," the young man replied. After he left, Dad quietly looked around the workshop. "You know, I think I forgot something." "What?" "Teaching." He ran one hand across the worn workbench. "For years I thought my job was making decisions." He shook his head slowly. "It should have been helping the next generation make better ones." I smiled. "I think Grandpa would have agreed." He laughed softly. "So would I." For the first time in decades, my father no longer introduced himself by his title. He simply said, "I work with the operations team." Somehow, it sounded more honest than anything he'd ever called himself before. Sophia changed too. Not overnight. At first, she hated walking factory floors. She complained about steel toe boots, the noise, the heat, the long hours. Then something unexpected happened. She started asking questions, real ones. One afternoon, she stopped beside a welder named Carlos. "I've approved budgets for welding equipment for 8 years," she admitted. "I've never actually watched someone use one." Carlos smiled. "You want to try?" She laughed nervously. "I'll probably embarrass myself." "You definitely will," he grinned. "But that's how everyone starts." She spent the next 30 minutes learning. Her first weld looked terrible. Everyone laughed, including her. 3 months later, she walked into my office carrying a revised budget proposal. "I need another $8 million." I looked up. "That's unlike you." "I know," she smiled. "I finally learned the cheapest decision isn't always the least expensive one." I signed the proposal immediately. Later that week, she asked if we could have dinner. Just the two of us. We hadn't done that in years. Halfway through the meal, she quietly set her fork down. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I used to think I was jealous because you became successful." She shook her head. "That wasn't it." "What was it?" "I was jealous because people followed you even before they knew your title." She smiled sadly. "I spent years trying to earn respect through promotions." "You earned it by understanding people." I reached across the table. "You worked hard too." "I know," she nodded. "I just worked hard climbing the ladder." "You spent your time making sure nobody forgot the people holding it up." Neither of us spoke for a while. Some apologies don't erase the past. They simply make the future possible. Almost 18 months after the acquisition, William officially retired. The company organized a ceremony inside the original manufacturing plant where he'd built his first production line nearly 50 years earlier. Hundreds of employees gathered, retirees returned, families filled the warehouse. At the center of the stage stood a long blue ribbon stretched across the entrance to our newest fully automated production line. William stepped to the microphone. "Traditionally, the person who cuts this ribbon should be the company's founder, or its chairman." He smiled toward me. "But today I'd like someone else to do it." He looked directly at my father. "Harold, would you join us?" The entire building applauded. Dad slowly walked onto the stage. William handed him the ceremonial scissors. For several seconds, Dad simply stared at them. Then he looked toward me. "No." The room became quiet. He smiled. "I've spent 30 years standing at the front." He carefully placed the scissors back into William's hands before turning toward me. "It's your turn." Every eye in the building shifted. I walked onto the stage almost reluctantly. Dad handed me the scissors himself. As I reached for them, he quietly whispered, so only I could hear, "I spent years trying to make you become your sister." His voice trembled slightly. "I never realized." "She should have been learning from you." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he did something I never expected. He hugged me. Not the quick, awkward kind we'd shared on birthdays. A real hug, the kind fathers give when they finally stop trying to fix something and simply accept what has always been there. The ribbon fell. The factory erupted into applause. Workers cheered. Cameras flashed. The new production line slowly came to life. I looked across hundreds of faces: mechanics, engineers, operators, apprentices, people who had built this company long before I ever owned it. William quietly stepped beside me. "So, how does it feel?" I smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "For years, I thought I wanted my parents to finally be proud of me. And I looked toward my father, laughing with employees only a few feet away. I don't think that was ever what I needed." William nodded. "What did you need?" I watched another group of apprentices walking through the factory wearing the same oversized safety glasses I'd once worn as a little girl. I just needed to become the kind of person who no longer questioned her own worth. The applause slowly faded into the ordinary sounds of a working factory: machines humming, forklifts moving, people solving problems together, Exactly the sounds that had first made me fall in love with places like this, years ago. My parents believed success could only be measured by degrees, titles, and corner offices. Life taught us something much different. A diploma can open a door. A title can place your name on an office. But neither one can make people trust you. Trust is earned in quieter ways, by listening before speaking, by showing up before sunrise, by remembering the names of the people whose hands actually build the future. The greatest promotion of my life wasn't becoming the owner of the company. It was finally becoming someone who no longer needed anyone else's permission. To believe she had always been enough.
Ah, this story reminds us that people often judge potential by appearances instead of character. Claire never wasted her energy proving her family wrong. She simply kept building the life she believed in. And honestly, I think that's the most powerful kind of success. Her father finally respected her, but by then Claire no longer needed his approval to know her worth. That's a lesson many of us can relate to. Keep growing, keep learning, and let your actions speak louder than anyone else's opinions. In the end, self-respect will always outlast someone else's validation. What do you think, Do?